Welcome to Tossing Grenade the Windmills. Windmills.
Hi, my name is Matt Franklin. Tom's mic has died a horrible death, and he's asked me to take over for him for the podcast for a little while. We were introduced through our mutual friend Andrew. Thanks, Andrew. All right, on to the podcast. This is the novel Grenademan vs. the Zombies by T.C. Ricks. Chapter 1, Part 2. The words escaping from his lips were whispers, shadows and hints of actual words, things that were never meant to imprint themselves upon the human mind. One by one, the others came to look through the peephole in the door, trying to figure out what he was doing. A thin mist surrounded him, creeping up his body and across his arms with a loving caress. His hair slowly moved around his body, the black and gray locks moving in an unholy rhythm to a different wind that did not touch the trees. A sudden, nameless darkness came to the skies, and a faint green and gold light moved up Jarvie's face, as though from a flashlight that wasn't there. He knew that the others were very frightened at this point, all of them except Oscar, who refused to believe. He couldn't hear their words, but he could see their faces through the glass, and he knew those faces well. The mist continued to rise up around him, expanding, enveloping the hill that contained the shelter and the house. Shapes slowly moved through the darkness. Jarvie pointed toward the metal door of the shelter. The shapes responded. Slowly, carefully, methodically, they shambled toward the door. The mist was thick and hard to see, but there was no doubt that it was a meaty human hand that began to pound on the door's surface. The smell of death and rotten decay filled the air, but Jarvie breathed it in like it was sweet perfume. This was his revenge. This was his triumph over their petty bickering and their refusal to acknowledge his worth. They wanted physical evidence? Well, he would give it to them. Oh, yes, he would. Gathering his will about him, he extended it out towards the shapes in the mist, willing them to continue the assault. On and on they came out of the night. Occasionally, there was the sound of breaking bones as one of the shadowed figures broke the rotted remains of its limbs against the door. As time passed, the moon rose in her ever-onward journey, reaching her zenith in the sky. Thin gaps in the clouds allowed pale light to dissipate the shadows and revealed the ghastly corpses below. There was no semblance of life to them. Each moved as if driven by 100 invisible puppeteers, propping it up against the will of gravity. Jarvie kept his concentration and his will focused upon the zombies and his assault. He dare not let his attention waver, lest the beasts turn and devour him. Furthermore, while he wanted to drive his point home, he had no immediate desire to slay them. After all, someone had to witness his triumph. As the night continued, Jarvie wondered in vain at the silence beyond the door. The creatures were simply not strong enough to break through the door with brute force alone, and he was running out of ideas and time. How could they be so seasoned against an actual manifestation of the supernatural? How could they resist the horror of death slowly wafting into their small little bunker? He moved slowly closer. He had not dared to before now, for fear one of the things might grab his arm and distract him. But time was running out. As he moved toward the door, he heard some low chanting. It sounded familiar. Closer, closer, closer he crept until finally the terrible words wrote themselves into his mind. Here's the story of a lovely lady who was bringing up 3 very lovely girls. Television? They dared to watch television on the night of his supreme triumph? If that was their key to weathering the madness about them, he had an answer. Focusing his will upon his thralls, he withdrew them from the door with a motion of his hand and set them forward and up the hill. It was slow at first. They had no fine motor control, but what they lacked in finesse they more than made up for in strength. He would destroy the solar panel. Their generator and their battery could only last them for so long. They were nearly within sight of the objective when the first lights of the sun rose on the distant horizon. With a sneer he cursed it until he felt the sympathetic rays of flame upon the flesh of the animated surrogates that expanded his will. It touched his mind with fire that burned it just as much as it burned him. He was in the corpses, part of them, and his mind was expelled from them. With fury, he reached to put out a fire that wasn't there. His minions did not fare so well, however, as the sun drove the last of the shadows from their rotting flesh, leaving only cold corpses behind. As the natural mist of the early morning crept onto the hill, it surrounded their flesh, giving them peaceful rest that Jarvie's magic had hitherto now denied them. The door hissed open, and Doc wandered out, looking well rested. He waved to Jarvie. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" Jarvie couldn't believe what he was seeing. This wasn't happening. Oscar came out right after Doc. He sneered at Jarvie and said, "Well, are you gonna pay up now?" Jarvie just stared at them. You didn't care?" "How could you not care?" he screamed at them. Doc laughed. "Do you think you're going to fool us with some actors hooked up with some face paint?" Beads and Kevin came out shortly thereafter. Beads was the first to notice the dead bodies lying around and scowled at Jarvie. "Just what do you think you're doing? Where did you get these? Some medical testing facility? They are real, right?" Kevin cautiously moved to check out the fallen, but was quickly overwhelmed by the stench. The rest stayed where they were. Kevin said, "They look pretty real to me." The grin on Doc's face slowly vanished. "All right, Jarvie, that's some pretty low pool. We're gonna have to report this to the police." Unbelievable. "The police?" Jarvie asked disbelievingly. "Yeah, Jarvie, did you think we weren't? I mean, sure, we're friends, but—" Jarvie scowled. "We are not friends. We never were friends." Doc looked mildly hurt and surprised. "But I thought—" "You thought nothing. If you had been my friends, you would have invested in my stock when I offered it to you. You'd all be rich now instead of chumps." Jarvie threw his hands up in the air and then motioned out to the bodies. "Do you think I'm just playing a game here, Doc? Do you think that this is fake? You claim to know me better than that." Doc's brow furrowed a moment. "Well, now that you mention it, yeah, I am kind of surprised at this kind of behavior from you, Jarvie. Are you okay?" "Okay? I unleashed the forces of darkness on you for a night, and you ask me if I'm okay?" Beads, braving the stench, moved to one of the bodies and turned it over. "I think this is my aunt. My God, you soulless thing. We buried her 3 months ago. You got these bodies?" Jarvie began to walk slowly backwards, back up the path. Perhaps discretion was the better part of valor here. "From the cemetery, yes. What part of raising the living dead do you fail to understand?" Oscar sneered. "Go ahead and run, but give us $2,000 before you do." Jarvie snickered. "You didn't win the bet." Oscar looked back at the shelter. "Did the zombies get in?" he asked. "No, but—" "Did the bet say how long the apocalypse was supposed to last, or how many zombies there were?" "Hold on. Even if we believe your lie, Jarvie, you still lost the bet. Now pay up." Jarvie stood there a moment. He hated them. He hated them with every fiber of his being, but he would honor his bets. And he had lost. He reached into his pocket and took out the money. He silently dropped it on the ground. He spun and turned to walk away. Doc said, "Hold it right there, Jarvie. You're not going anywhere." There was an edge to his voice, though, that made Jarvie satisfied. Doc clearly was starting to believe that this hadn't been an elaborate hoax on Jarvie's part. Jarvie turned around slowly, his eyes glowing a solid red. The faint light from nowhere that graced his face the night previous now appeared again, but this time with the colors of sunrise that mixed and wove on his features, as if he were not a man at all, but a demented pewter doll standing in the wind. "I'll go where I want." Oscar pointed at Jarvie and laughed. "Look, Jarvie has glow-in-the-dark contacts." Beads joined in, saying, "I could get those at any con. A little glow-in-the-dark face paint and a UV light. Give it up, Jarvie." After picking up a piece of clothing from one of the dead bodies and watching it turn to ash, Kevin whispered, "I don't see a UV light." "So what? You don't see much of anything." Oscar took a swig of soda he had brought with him out of the shelter and belched. He then crushed the can in his large hand and tossed it behind him. The example of what it was supposed to mean was not lost on Jarvie. Oscar said, Pay up. Jarvie used the anima to make the money float up off the ground, and then had it float gently across the air and land in a nice pile of $100 bills stacked on Oscar's left shoe. Everyone but Oscar looked at the money with an expression of utter astonishment. Jarvie loved every minute of that look. It had been worth the prices he had been forced to pay to get the power. He looked up and sneered. "Goodbye, Doc." But when Jarvie was about to invoke the travel spell, Oscar opened his mouth one more time. "You jerk, you're a complete fake." Jarvie almost got angry. He almost made a rock lift up out of the ground and slam Oscar's skull into a million pieces. Almost. Instead, he said, "I'm a fake, huh?" Doc looked warningly at Oscar. "I don't like where this is going. Give it up, Oscar. Settle this another day." Oscar, however, did not seem to be in the mood to let anything go. "Yeah, you heard me. You're a fake, a charlatan, a complete fucking maroon." "Well," Jarvie said. "Want proof?" His body became alight with scarlet flame. The smell of brimstone filled the air. "Sure, why not? I'll bet you any time, sucker." Oscar put his foot forward and his hands at his sides confidently. "Well, how about the same bet, only on a slightly larger scale?" Oscar was obviously not even paying attention. "Whatever." "So, say, 6 months of preparation, only this time I sent a real zombie apocalypse. The stake is your soul." Oscar said, "Whatever." Jarvie honestly didn't know if he could actually do anything with Oscar's soul, but at this point he was willing to prove a point. Oscar was going down, and so was everyone else. "Done." Doc, staring speechless at Jarvie, suddenly spoke. "And what do we get?" "We? You're in on this as well?" Doc looked uncomfortable. "It's kind of hard to have an apocalypse against one person, isn't it? I mean, it sounds like we're part of this whether or not we want to be." Jarvie smiled. Now they believed him. Or at least Doc did. "What do you propose?" Doc thought only a moment, then said, "Your power. If we survive a month, you lose all of your power." "Done." Jarvie wasn't about to pass that up. It wasn't his power to start with. "Good luck, gentlemen and lady. You're going to need it." His laugh was not exactly of the mad scientist caliber, but it was an excellent start. He didn't care if they called the police. It would be hard for them to catch up to him where he was going. He vanished in a puff of fire and brimstone. He had quite a bit of work to do.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Thomas Ricks. Music by Melanie Ricks. Voices by Skip Huffman and Josie Bergen-Lawson. Copyright 2012, Red Anvil Amalgamated.
To fight the forces of evil!